The wind knows things the living have forgotten. It remembers every candle that ever flickered in every window, every prayer whispered into the darkness of a Highland winter, every tear that froze before it could fall. On Christmas Eve of 1932, in a stone cottage perched on the edge of Loch Ness, where the mountains touch the sky and hold it there, the wind carried something more than snow. It carried the weight of a love that refused to die, threading through the frozen heather like memory itself, seeking the one window where a single candle still burned, where a woman named Margaret MacLeod was about to discover that death is merely a door, not an ending. The cottage stood alone against the vastness of the Scottish Highlands, its gray stones darkened by a century of storms, its windows small and deep-set, like eyes that had seen too much. Inside, the air hung thick with peat smoke and the peculiar silence that settles into homes where laughter has been absent too long. The floorboards, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, creaked their familiar song as Margaret moved through rooms that still held the shape of her husband's absence. His pipe on the mantle, cold these 11 months, his coat on its hook by the door, the sleeves still holding the memory of his arms. The Christmas tree stood in the corner of the parlor, a small Highland pine she had cut herself 3 days prior, its branches dressed in the same glass ornaments that had belonged to Duncan's mother, each one catching the firelight and throwing it back in fragments of gold and amber, like pieces of the past refusing to let go. She had decorated it out of habit more than hope, her fingers moving through the ritual of Christmas as one moves through a dream half remembered. The year 1932 had been cruel to Scotland, as it had been cruel to the world, the depression reaching even into these remote highlands where people had always known how to live with little. But Margaret's poverty was of a different kind. It was the poverty of the heart, the emptiness that comes when the other half of your soul has been torn away. Duncan had died on Hogmanay, the last day of the previous year, the influenza taking him just as the bells were ringing in 1932, as if death itself had waited for that precise moment between years, between hope and despair. The doctor had come through the snow, but there was nothing to be done. Duncan's fever had burned through him like wildfire through dry heather, leaving nothing but ash and memory. The clock on the mantle, a wedding gift from 37 years past, ticked toward midnight with the steady persistence of time that cares nothing for human grief. Margaret sat in Duncan's chair. She had finally begun to think of it as simply a chair again, though her body still felt like a trespass in its worn embrace. The fire in the grate had burned low, just embers now glowing like eyes in the darkness, and she considered whether to add another piece of peat or let it die. Let it die, perhaps, as everything must. But then she heard it, or thought she heard it, a sound like paper rustling, though there was no wind inside the cottage, no draft to disturb the stillness. She turned toward the tree, and that's when she saw it. There, beneath the lowest branches where the candlelight barely reached, lay a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a ribbon the color of Scottish heather in bloom. It had not been there an hour ago when she had knelt to adjust the tree skirt. It had not been there this morning, or yesterday, or any day since she had placed the tree in its stand. Yet there it sat, as real as the boards beneath it, as solid as the walls around her. Her heart, which had been quiet for so long, suddenly remembered how to race. She rose from the chair, her knees protesting the cold that had settled into them, and moved toward the tree with the careful steps of one approaching a miracle or a curse, unsure which it might be. The paper was old, she could see that even in the dim light, yellowed at the edges like the pages of a book left too long in the sun. But the ribbon was fresh, still holding the purple-gray color of heather in August, still soft to the touch when she finally found the courage to kneel and lift the package. It weighed almost nothing, as if it contained air or memory or something equally insubstantial. Her name was written on it in a hand she knew better than her own. The letters formed with the particular slant that Duncan had learned in the village school 70 years ago, when Victoria was still queen and the world was a different place entirely. Margaret MacLeod, it read, and below that, in smaller letters, "For my beloved who keeps Christmas still." The cottage seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind outside had stilled, and the snow fell straight down past the windows in the kind of silence that exists only in the depths of winter, when the world wraps itself in white and waits. Margaret's fingers trembled as she turned the package over, finding no other marking, no explanation for its impossible presence. The clock struck the quarter hour, the sound sharp in the stillness, and she realized she had been kneeling there for longer than she thought, the package cradled in her lap like a child or a prayer. She thought of calling for Mrs. Morrison from the neighboring croft, though neighboring was a relative term when the nearest house was a mile across the moor. She thought of leaving the package unopened, of placing it back beneath the tree and pretending she had never seen it. She thought of many things, but her fingers were already working at the ribbon, pulling gently at the knot that had been tied with Duncan's particular way of making a bow. The rabbit ears, he'd called it, teaching their daughter Agnes the same method when she was small, before the consumption took her at 17, before the Great War took their son Jamie at 23, before time took everything except this cottage and the memories that lived in its walls like mice in the thatch. The ribbon fell away and the paper followed, crackling like fire in the silence. Inside was a small wooden box, the kind Duncan had carved in the evenings while she knitted, his hands always needing to be busy, to be making something beautiful from something plain. She recognized his work in the careful joints, the smooth finish that came from hours of patient sanding, the tiny thistle carved into the lid. Scotland's flower, he'd always said, beautiful and sharp, like the land itself. The box was warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting by a fire, though the paper that had wrapped it was cold as the December air. She opened it, and inside was a piece of sea glass, green as summer, smooth as water, attached to a fine silver chain. She knew this piece of glass. She had found it herself on their honeymoon in Oban, walking the shore in a happiness so complete it had felt like drowning in light. She had kept it on the windowsill in the kitchen for 37 years, where it caught the morning sun and threw green shadows on the white walls. But when Duncan died, she had placed it in his coffin, tucked it into the pocket of his Sunday suit where his heart would have been, a piece of their beginning to carry with him into whatever came after. She had watched the coffin lid close over it, had thrown the first handful of frozen earth onto the wood, had heard it rattle like bones. Yet here it was in her hand, warm as blood, real as grief, impossible as love itself. The chain was new, or seemed new, bright silver that caught the candlelight and held it. There was something else in the box, folded small, a piece of paper, the same yellowed color as the wrapping. She unfolded it with fingers that no longer trembled but moved with the strange calm that comes when one passes beyond fear into something else entirely. Duncan's handwriting again, but different, more careful, as if written by someone who had infinite time, infinite patience. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "time moves differently here, where I am. I watch you through the veil that separates us, thin as morning mist over the loch, thick as the stone of cairns. I watch you keep our home, tend our garden, light the candle in the window each night, though you believe no one sees it. I see it, Mograd. I see everything. The glass you gave me has been my anchor, my reminder that love is the only thing that travels between worlds unchanged. I return it to you now, transformed, as I have been transformed. Wear it and know that I am not gone, only changed, only waiting in the place where all loves meet again, where Christmas comes not once a year but always, eternal as the mountains, constant as the tide. When you see the green light through it, know that I see you. When you feel it warm against your heart, know that my love surrounds you still. The winter will end, as all winters do. Until then, and always, I remain your devoted Duncan." The paper fell from her fingers, drifting to the floor like a leaf in autumn. She lifted the necklace, the sea glass catching the dying firelight, and in its depths she saw something that made her breath catch. A light that wasn't reflection, wasn't the candles or the embers, but something else, something green and gold and alive, moving like water, like memory, like love itself, made visible. She clasped it around her neck, the silver chain cold at first against her skin, then warming quickly as if responding to her pulse, her life, her stubborn insistence on continuing despite everything. The cottage, which had felt like a tomb for 11 months, suddenly felt different. Not empty, but waiting. Not abandoned, but watched over. She could smell something she hadn't noticed before. Pine resin, fresh and sharp, though the tree had been cut days ago. And something else, fainter but unmistakable. Pipe tobacco, the particular blend Duncan had favored, bought from McBride's shop in Inverness twice a year. She turned, expecting to see smoke rising from his pipe on the mantle, but it remained cold and still. Yet the scent persisted, weaving through the air like a signature, a presence, a promise. She rose from her knees, her body feeling lighter than it had in months, and moved to the window. The snow had stopped, and the clouds had parted to reveal stars so bright they seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The loch below was a mirror of black glass, perfectly still, reflecting the heavens so clearly that sky and water became one seamless thing, infinite and holy. And there, just at the edge of her vision, she saw movement. A figure walking along the shore where she and Duncan had walked every evening for 37 years. The same steady gait, the same slight favor of the left leg from the accident in the quarry when he was young. Her heart knew before her mind would accept it. She pressed her hand to the glass, her palm leaving a print in the frost, and the figure stopped, turned, raised a hand in greeting or farewell. She couldn't tell which, perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps something for which there were no words in the language of the living. Then the clouds closed again, and the figure was gone, if it had ever been there at all. But the sea glass against her chest was warm, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her heart, and she knew with the certainty that comes only in the deepest nights of winter that she had not imagined it. The clock struck midnight, and Christmas Day began with the sound of bells carried on the wind from the village church 3 miles away. But there was another sound too, closer, impossible, the sound of footsteps on the path outside, the particular crunch of boots on frozen gravel that she had heard every evening for decades. The footsteps circled the cottage once, as Duncan had always done, checking that all was secure, that the henhouse was latched, that the woodpile was covered. Then they stopped at the door, and she heard, felt more than heard, a knock. Not on the wood, but on something deeper. Some door between worlds that stood forever ajar on Christmas Eve, when miracle and memory became the same thing. She did not open the door. She knew without knowing that it wasn't meant to be opened, that Duncan wasn't asking to come in but telling her he had never left. Instead, she lit a new candle from the dying flame of the old one, placed it in the window, and sat back in his chair. Her chair now, their chair always. The fire had died to nothing, but the room was warm, filled with that presence that was not quite presence, that weight of love that bends the very air around it. She fingered the sea glass at her throat and found that if she held it up to catch the candlelight just so, she could see through it as through a window into another place, a place where snow fell upward like souls ascending, where the dead decorated trees with stars pulled down from heaven, where every Christmas that had ever been existed simultaneously, layer upon layer of love and light and loss, transformed into something else, something better. The days that followed were different, not easier. Grief is not so quickly dismissed, but deeper, richer, touched with a strangeness that made even the mundane feel sacred. She would find things moved in the night, Duncan's books rearranged on the shelf, his chair angled toward the fire as he had always preferred it, the good tea brought down from the high cupboard where she could barely reach. Once, she woke to find the kitchen window open and snow on the sill forming words she couldn't quite read, melting before she could make them out. Another morning, all the clocks in the house had stopped at 11:47, the exact moment Duncan had died, but they started again when she touched them, as if they had only been pausing to remember. Mrs. Morrison came by on Boxing Day, bringing soup and sympathy as she had every few days since Duncan's death. But this time she stopped in the doorway, her eyes widening. "You look different, Margaret," she said. "Not younger exactly, but lighter somehow, like you're carrying less weight." Margaret touched the sea glass beneath her collar, hidden but warm, and smiled, the first real smile in 11 months. "Perhaps I am," she said, and left it at that. But Mrs. Morrison lingered, looking around the cottage as if seeing it for the first time. And before she left, she said, "It feels different here too. Warmer, like someone's just stepped out and will be back any moment." That night, Margaret found another gift beneath the tree. Impossible, impossible, but there it was. This time a small leather journal, its pages filled with Duncan's handwriting, but not letters, musical notes. A composition she didn't recognize. She couldn't read music, had never learned despite Duncan's patient attempts to teach her. But when she hummed what she thought the notes might sound like, she found she knew the melody after all. It was the song he had hummed while working, wordless and wandering, different each time but always the same in some essential way. Now it was written down, captured, made permanent. On the last page he had written, "Music exists in both worlds. When you hear this, know I am singing with you." The winter deepened, January bringing snows that buried the cottage to the windowsills, February bringing ice that turned the world to crystal. But inside, Margaret was warm, wrapped in the strange comfort of a haunting that felt like home. She began to talk to Duncan again, not as one talks to the dead, but as she had always talked to him, about the chickens, about the weather, about Mrs. Morrison's gossip from the village. And sometimes, just sometimes, she heard answers in the wind rattling the windows, in the settling of the house at night, in the particular way the fire crackled when she mentioned his name. She found more gifts as the winter wore on, always when she wasn't looking for them, always when she needed them most. A sprig of heather, purple and fresh, on a day when the world was nothing but white and gray. A smooth stone from the loch, warm as a hand, when the cold made her joints ache. A single page torn from a book, their favorite poem, the one he'd read to her on their wedding night, appearing on her pillow like a blessing or a promise. Each gift came wrapped in that same old paper, tied with that same heather-colored ribbon, each impossible, each perfect, each a small defeat of death by love. The village began to talk, as villages do. Margaret MacLeod was touched, they said, touched by grief, by loneliness, by the long Highland winter. But then strange things began to happen to them too. Mr. Gillespie found his father's watch, lost 20 years ago, in his Christmas pudding. The Campbell children saw lights in the old kirk that had been abandoned since the cholera outbreak of 1902. Mrs. Fraser's daughter, sick with scarlet fever, recovered overnight after claiming a man with kind eyes had sat by her bed, singing songs she didn't know in a voice she recognized but couldn't place. By March, when the first crocuses pushed through the snow, Margaret had accepted the impossible as simply another fact of life, like sunrise or sorrow. Duncan was gone and Duncan was here, and both things were true simultaneously. The way light is both wave and particle, the way love is both memory and presence. She wore the sea glass always now, had learned to see through it properly, not with her eyes, but with something else, some organ of perception that grief had awakened or created. Through it, she could see the world as it really was, not a place where the living and dead were separated, but where they overlapped constantly, like two photographs laid one atop the other, creating a third image more beautiful and terrible than either alone. One night in early April, when the ice was breaking up on the loch with sounds like gunshots or heartbreak, she saw Duncan clearly for the first time since his death. Not a glimpse, not a shadow, but Duncan himself, sitting in his chair by the fire, pipe in hand, looking at her with eyes full of love and sorrow and something else, patience perhaps, or understanding. He looked younger than when he died, but also older, as if he had aged in different ways, learned different things. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came, or none that her ears could catch. But she read his lips, the shape of words she knew. Not yet, Mograd. Not yet, but soon. She understood then what the gifts had been trying to tell her, what Duncan had been preparing her for all through the winter. Not his return, but her departure. Not resurrection, but reunion. The sea glass at her throat grew warm, and through it she could see not just Duncan but others. Agnes in her white confirmation dress, Jamie in his soldier's uniform, her parents, his parents, all the beloved dead waiting in that place where winter never comes or never ends, where Christmas is not a day but a state of being, where love proves itself stronger than death not by denying it but by transcending it. The tuberculosis came with the spring rains, as it often did in the Highlands. The doctor was sent for, but Margaret knew before he arrived what he would say. She had seen it in Duncan's eyes that night by the fire, had felt it in the weight of the sea glass against her chest, had known it in the way the gifts had grown more frequent, more urgent, as if time were running out for miracles. She took to her bed in early May, when the heather was just beginning to purple the hills, and found she wasn't afraid. The cottage filled with visitors, Mrs. Morrison and her daughter, the minister from the village, neighbors she hadn't seen in months. They came to comfort her, but found themselves comforted instead, going away with stories of the strange peace in that house, the sense of presence that made death seem less like an ending than a doorway. On her last night, the cottage filled with the scent of pine and snow, though it was June and warm. The sea glass at her throat caught the evening light and cast green shadows on the ceiling that moved like water, like memory, like souls in flight. She could hear music, Duncan's song, the one he had written down for her, but played now on instruments she couldn't name, in harmonies that human ears weren't meant to hear, but that the dying can sometimes catch, in that moment when they stand between worlds. She closed her eyes and felt Duncan's hand in hers, real as it had ever been, warm and calloused from years of work, gentle as it had been on their wedding night when he had trembled with the weight of so much happiness. She opened her eyes, not the eyes of her body, but the eyes that the sea glass had taught her to use, and saw him there, young and old simultaneously, wearing his Sunday suit, but also his work clothes, his uniform from the war that had taken him to France, but brought him back, every version of himself that had ever been, all existing at once in this moment outside of time. Behind him stood Agnes, laughing as she had laughed at 16, before the sickness touched her, and Jamie, tall and proud, the fear gone from his eyes, replaced by a peace that passeth understanding, and behind them, more figures than she could count, all the MacLeods and Morrisons and Campbells who had lived and died in these Highlands, going back and back and back to the beginning of memory, all waiting, all welcoming, all proof that love creates a gravity that pulls souls together across any distance, even death. Margaret felt herself rising, not from the bed, but from something deeper, rising like smoke from peat, like mist from the loch, like prayers from the mouths of the faithful. The sea glass at her throat dissolved into light, green and gold and infinite, and she understood at last that it had never been sea glass at all, but a fragment of something larger, a piece of the vast window between worlds that Duncan had broken through to reach her, to tell her that death was not a wall but a door, not an ending but a transformation, like water to ice to steam, the same thing in different forms, love persisting through every change. The cottage stood empty for years after, but never felt abandoned. Visitors, hikers, and tourists drawn by the wild beauty of the Highlands would sometimes shelter there from storms and come away with stories they only half believed, stories of warmth without fire, of music without source, of finding small gifts, a flower out of season, a smooth stone, a piece of sea glass, that they couldn't explain but couldn't forget. The locals knew better than to disturb the place. It belonged to the MacLeods still, they said, and always would, though whether they meant the living or the dead, none could say. One Christmas Eve, decades later, a young couple lost in a blizzard found the cottage and took shelter. In the morning, they discovered a package beneath the remnants of what had once been a Christmas tree, now just a shadow stained into the floorboards. Inside was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, and 2 fragments of green sea glass on silver chains. The paper contained just one line written in 2 different hands that had learned to write as one. Love is the only gift that travels between worlds unchanged. They took the sea glass and left the cottage different than they'd entered it, carrying with them the knowledge that death is smaller than love, that winter always ends, that somewhere, in the place where all Christmases exist at once, Margaret and Duncan MacLeod are still decorating their tree, still finding gifts beneath it, still discovering that the only miracle that matters is the one that happens every day, in every heart that refuses to let love die just because the beloved has. The wind still knows things the living have forgotten, but sometimes, on Christmas Eve, when the snow falls straight down and the world wraps itself in white and silence, someone finds a gift they can't explain, feels a presence they can't name, hears a song they've never learned but somehow know. And in that moment, the veil wears thin, and all the love that ever was rushes through like light through sea glass, green as summer in the depths of winter, warm as memory, real as the impossible gift that waits beneath every tree for those who still believe that love is stronger than death, and love is always stronger than death.